In this second video on Parmenides, we will explore some of his arguments and wrap up some of his main points. And just as a reminder, in our first video, part one, we had Parmenides conclude that conceivability is going to be the same thing as possibility, and that means that something would exist, and that means that there is necessary existence. So he completely collapsed those modal distinctions, and he did it for the positive side as well as the negative side. So if something doesn't exist, it's not conceivable and it's not possible for it to exist. There is an alternative way of thinking about this, and here seems to be the reasoning of Parmenides. He says that if a thing can be thought about, then it's possible for it to exist. We did see that a little bit earlier, right? Something has to exist in order to be there, to be thought about. And he has this claim: if anything does not exist, then it is not possible for it to exist. And the phrase anything does not exist, really that's a reference to nothing. So nothing can't exist. It just is impossible. It's nothing. So it's not something that could exist. And then the third idea here, we take what we just said. If anything does not exist, then it is not possible for it to exist. And we contrapose that. That's a logical principle. So we have a logically equivalent sentence in 3. If it is possible for something to exist, then it does exist. So we have that claim supported. And then if you put 3 together with 1, you conclude that if a thing can be thought about, then it exists. That would just be a conditional syllogism there. And finally, we have if a thing does not exist, then it cannot be thought about. That's the contraposition of 4. So we have a reason to believe that. Now, it seems that we can. In other words, it seems that we can think about things that don't exist. Little green gremlins helping out the Celtics by helping their baskets. I guess those are supposed to be leprechauns. These kinds of things, right? Well, suppose something does not exist. Parmenides says in order for it to come into existence, it must come from something that exists or from something that does not exist, right? You have to have one of those two possibilities. And if it couldn't come from something that exists, because then it would already exist. It would already be there in that thing. But it couldn't come from something that does not exist, because nothing comes from nothing. That's not even possible for something just to pop into existence. So that which is not or does not exist cannot be or come into existence, right? Another way of thinking about this, or an implication of this, is the idea that becoming is an illusion, right? Coming into existence is an illusion. It's impossible. And so for Parmenides, I think this is the most straightforward way of reading his text. We have to trust our reasoning over our senses. And even though it appears that things come into existence, it's actually an illusion, and nothing could possibly come into existence that didn't already exist. What about time? For Parmenides, there are no temporal differences. So this is a quote from the text, and it's very important that you read all parts of the text where we're getting these ideas from. He says, nor was it ever, nor will it be, since it is now. He wants to get rid of past and future. And if there are no temporal differences, well, then there can be no change. Now, why is that? A change would involve a coming into being of a new situation. But that's not possible, right? Something new cannot come into existence. There is no generation or becoming, right? We've already concluded that. So really time is an illusion as well. Another conclusion of Parmenides is that there is no plurality. This is the extreme monism thesis. So the followers of Parmenides, Zeno and Melissus, for example, explicitly claimed this and had different arguments for it, that there is no plurality. All is one. Here is an argument from Parmenides. It goes by a reductio ad absurdum. Suppose there are two or more objects instead of just one. For example, suppose there are just objects A and B. He asked us to consider this. Since there are two, there must be a property that one has and the other lacks, otherwise they would be identical. So call that property F. So let's say A is F and B is not F. That's what makes them distinct and allows them to be two separate objects. The problem is when you say B is not F, you're supposing to speak of what is not. It's the kind of sentence that doesn't make sense because for Parmenides, you can't even think about what is not, right? We just went through that argument. So there is no B that fits our description, which means there are not two objects after all. There is no plurality. All that exists is one. So in summarizing what Parmenides had to say, some of his theses here, an object can be thought about if and only if that object exists. And if something does not exist, it cannot exist. And it's not possible to think about what does not exist. And to wrap all these things together, there's no becoming, there's no change, there is no motion, there is no plurality. As we saw, there was no time we could add to the list. All of that is an illusion that people believe. That's Parmenides, but what might be said as a criticism? There are two that I will bring up. This first criticism, let's consider this claim, what does not exist could not exist. So the first criticism questions that. And the idea here is, why could not that which is not come to be from what is by a change in quality or form? Now, Parmenides argued against this, but if we think of it in this way, he seems to equivocate on nothing, or at least he equivocates on the phrase, what is not. Now, let me explain. Here is a sentence using the word nothing. Nothing is better than spending time with you. Well, depending on who said it, how they said it, who heard it, you might take this sentence in two different ways depending on how you understand nothing. So in the one case, if it's a compliment, right, it's meant to say there is no thing that I could be doing that would be better than spending time with you, right? However, if someone's a little chippy, they might think of this as an insult, right? Doing nothing or there not being anything at all would be better than having to spend time with you, right? And so nothing could be used in different ways with these two different meanings. And it seems like Parmenides is doing that when he's using these arguments about what is not and what is. A second criticism of Parmenides is that he assumes that denials of any kind are denials of existence. So we saw that when we said B is not F. But that doesn't seem to be the case. For one thing, we introduced the idea of properties, but consider this negative claim. Suppose somebody claims that there are no English-speaking dogs. Well, that's not really a claim that there are English-speaking dogs that do not exist, right? It's not that nonsensical contradiction. But instead, it's a claim that of the dogs that in fact exist, we're talking about things that do exist, not one of them speaks English. That is, none has the property of being English speaking. And that seems to be very different from the kind of claim that Parmenides has to assume in order to get his arguments to work. These two criticisms I'm pulling partly from Aristotle, and as we'll see if you look at the videos on Aristotle, he's the man and he can solve these problems that the pre-Socratics are raising. But for now, that concludes our time with Parmenides. We need to look next at Zeno.